Great, thank you so much. I don't quite know how to follow those two exceptional papers. They're fascinating. So if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. The story will be familiar to many of us. In the wake of allegations of sexual assault made against Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein, Me Too began trending across social media platforms as hundreds, then thousands, then millions used the hashtag to identify themselves as survivors of sexual violation in its myriad forms. Me Too has evolved into a shorthand, on the one hand encouraging survivors to come forward and challenge their perpetrators, and on the other, a pejorative to resist desired reforms of the movement and to peddle facile criticisms of it, such as it making dating impossible or killing off the office Christmas party. Me Too resists easy definitions of its scope and its purpose. Johanna Stieber captures the movement's multi-purpose character. It was first about exposing the problem of widespread sexual violation, and second about gathering support for tackling the injustices. She also points to the growing criticisms of the Me Too movement, its lack of inclusiveness and intersectionality, the power illiteracy of its privileged and high-profile proponents, and how the originator of the phrase Me Too, Tarana Burke, feels the movement is unrecognizable from her pre-existing activism. With these criticisms in mind, my definition of a Me Too reading, which I adopt for this paper, involves raising awareness of sexual abuse in its multifarious forms, the hearing of stories, paying particular attention to and elevating the experiences of the most powerless, embracing discomfort and challenge as the hearer, understanding that being trusted with stories is a gift, not a right, and recognizing that with that greater awareness comes a growing command to pursue justice. In short, my hope as a Me Too lens is attentive, compassionate, humble, and dynamic. I'm also a Christian ethicist, not a biblical scholar, although we of course share a core text in the Bible, but I do come with the priorities of the former, namely how we bring together the deontic command of God and the formation of our moral character to live the ethical life in pursuit of the good. In the realm of sexual violation, to be adequate, Christian moral reflection must begin with real experience, not with romantic fantasies. A Me Too reading resists any idealistic or romantic understanding, following God's command to pay attention to the reality of sin and to embrace the disquieting of my own status quo as the encounter with sin's reality and God's command directs the trajectory of my moral formation. Thus, my purpose for this paper is twofold, offering a Me Too reading of the Matthean genealogy, and then suggesting how such a reading meets the field of Christian ethics, each informing the other as they attend the topic of sexual violation and its concomitant issues. So the genealogy of Jesus, as recorded in Matthew 1:1-17, is notable for its inclusion of 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, that is Bathsheba. In different ways, these 4 women can all be said to have their own Me Too stories. First, Tamar in Genesis 38. Her first husband, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Tamar is then married off to her brother-in-law, Onan, who denied her reproductive justice by deliberately spilling his semen. Returned to her father's house, her father-in-law, Judah, mistakes her for a prostitute, sleeps with her, and impregnates her. When Judah learns of Tamar's pregnancy, he demands she be burned for what he perceives as her promiscuity. But he is chastened when she proves he is the one who impregnated her. Tamar's Me Too story is manifold. She suffers mistreatment at the hands of her intimate partners, and she is subject to slut shaming and punishment due to her sexuality. Moreover, Tamar's story highlights the hypocrisy of her perpetrator's actions. Judah treating her as property to be controlled on the one hand and exploited on the other. Judah's actions articulate what Will Gaffney describes as the disdain Israel has for sex workers among its own women, while permitting its men to seek sex workers of other national and ethnic identities. Tamar's story can be heard as one of coercive control and the justification of abuse when it is aimed at an other. Second, Rahab, who in Joshua 2 assists the Israelites in capturing the city of Jericho. In discussions of what unites the women of the Matean genealogy, some scholars suggest that what Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba share is sexual sinfulness. Such an interpretation is a classic example of an androcentric exegesis, which associates women with sexuality, connects sexuality with sin, and shuts eyes to the far from irreproachable conduct of many men in the genealogy. They mould Rahab to this reading solely upon her being a prostitute, making various sexist assumptions. First, that it is something that she might have freely chosen. Second, that she exercises that role somehow in a vacuum. And third, with no textual evidence that she is doing anything sinful, especially given the Israelite code of ethics, whose adherents were content to use women as prostitutes, but were condemnatory of their character. Richard Davidson. With the exception of her mention in the Matean genealogy, Rahab's appearances in the New Testament assign her the epithet of harlot. She is defined through judgments about her sexuality, perceived as honourable despite her actions. Her MeToo story is one of microaggressions which accumulate as part of rape culture, where prevailing norms and attitudes and misogynistic practices are validated and rationalised through various acts of sexism. As one linguist points out, if you want to insult a woman, call her a prostitute. Rahab's MeToo may not be the most egregious, but it highlights the rape culture which enables sexism to flourish and escalate. Third, the story of Ruth. Three interpretations of her story as sexual violence are usually offered. First, Ruth is a victim of sexual violation in the sense that she is vulnerable to it and must take precautions to protect herself. Boaz warns her not to leave the field she is in and instructs the other men not to harass her. The implication is that Ruth is vulnerable to the behaviour of other men. She has to boundary her movements and actions to preserve her safety. This interpretation highlights the accumulative toll of emotional labour and enculturation into constant fear, which binds women who are forced to operate in a way that is diametrically opposed to their pursuit of freedom. A second reading of Ruth's story assesses the power imbalance between Ruth and Boaz, problematising their relationship as one of inequality. And a third reading, posited by Will Gaffney, argues Ruth is a victim of what she calls sexploitation by her mother-in-law Naomi, who pushes her into sexual servitude. Ruth's MeToo story enables us to hear a range of stories and experiences, all of which are encompassed by the movement. And finally, the story of Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11-12. The reception history of Bathsheba is often unfaithful to the biblical narrative. Leonard Cohen portrays her as performatively sensual. Sebastiano Ricci paints her naked as a blatant exhibitionist. And in the film, David and Bathsheba, she is written as David's stalker. Although presented neutrally in the text, her actions have been twisted by some to conform her to the sexual temptress trope. For example, according to one scholar, being deliberately provocative by bathing near the palace. Yet this overlooks David's actions. It is his palace providing the vantage point to see her. It is his gaze which finds Bathsheba when she has taken herself away to engage in purificatory rituals. He sends messengers to bring her to him, and he sleeps with her. Given the power dynamic and all that we know about sexual consent, it is hard to read consensuality into Bathsheba's actions. Upon my hearing, her MeToo story is one of rape. This is just a cursory hearing of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba's MeToo stories, but they reveal the absence of homogeneity in MeToo experiences. They also demonstrate the scope of a systemic lack of sexual justice, especially for women, and within that, women who are in any way considered other. Through their presence in the Matean genealogy, the stories of these women are inexorably linked with the Incarnation in Jesus Christ. I want to suggest two major ways in which a MeToo reading of the genealogy aids Christian ethics in its understanding of and response to sexual violation as experienced by these women and many others since. Specifically, a MeToo reading is both silence breaking and justice bringing. So in 2017, Time magazine named as its Person of the Year the Silence Breakers. They were film stars, pop stars, activists, hospital workers, politicians, dishwashers, strawberry pickers. They were white, black, Hispanic, Asian, women and men, straight and LGBT, named and anonymous. Their stories ran the gamut of the MeToo spectrum. They were silence breakers, not only for themselves, but vicariously for all those with MeToo stories. In a similar vein, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba are vicarious silence breakers, not just for those in the Hebrew Bible who have MeToo stories, but for all who identify with them. Just as Time silence breakers are united and representative of others with MeToo stories, so are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba representative silence breakers. The Incarnation is God's revelation of himself. MeToo stories have likewise been described as revelations. So in the Matthean genealogy, these two forms of revelation come together. The Incarnation is an establishment of relations between God and human beings. As Rowan Williams notes, the human person engaged in relation by Jesus is connected to the Word of God in and through that relation. And depending on the condition and orientation of that person, such a connection may bring both promise and judgment. For those who can say me too, it brings the promise that their suffering has been noticed, their experience is heard. The Hebrew Bible stories of texts of terror do not lose relevance just because there is now a New Testament. The injustice against them is condemned, and it can also provide survivors, victims, with contemporary survivors and victims with a hermeneutic of suspicion for approaching the Christian gospel when so much sexual violation has been perpetrated in the Christian gospel's name. God has never been silent on the worthiness of flesh, but the Incarnation breaks any doubt of his silence on it. As Michael Lloyd notes, what dignifies us most as a species is that God became one of us. It gives us a dignity and a sanctity of which we would not otherwise dream. In the juxtaposition in the genealogy of degraded and abused flesh and the flesh of God incarnate as the Christ child, silence is broken on the extent to which humanity has departed from God's vision of love for his human creation. The MeToo genealogy demonstrates that the Incarnation does not forget what has come before, rather that what has happened, in this case sexual injustice, has been noticed by God, and he is not finished with that problem. But the silence breaking of the Incarnation also warns of judgment for perpetrators, which cannot be evaded. Walter Brueggemann states that the primary purpose of silence breaking is to challenge those afforded power by the status quo, but just who and what constitutes the status quo is contestable. One of the criticisms of MeToo is that it may unintentionally help perpetrators of sexual abuse by normalising abuse or by caricaturing perpetrators as monsters against whom, to quote Uriah Stiebert, regular variety perpetrators might compare themselves favourably. However, the Incarnation as a precursor of God's ultimate judgment breaks this silence, holding perpetrators accountable for their sin, whatever its form. As Jesus warns, nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Tamar and Bathsheba's abusers are named. They cannot extricate their abuse from their legacies. They are still subject to judgment. This should disquiet us, compel us to search ourselves for any complicity, oblige our own silence breaking for how we may have abetted the status quo. When Bathsheba is quasi-erased as the wife of Uriah, the lack of full revelation of her story functions as a reminder that the work of silence breaking is far from over. No longer can we either simply enjoy a sanitized Christmas story with just a shadow of the tragedy for Jesus to come. We are reminded of the tragedies of sin from the past. The MeToo genealogy is silence breaking for those women and all they represent. It constitutes a breaking of God's silence concerning the divinely sanctioned dignity of flesh, and a silence breaking of Christian ethics on addressing the issue, and highlights the ongoing need for silence breaking around sexual abuse and injustice. In her moving, visceral and arguably prophetic victim impact statement at the sentencing of her abuser, the gymnast, lawyer and abuse survivors advocate Rachel Den Hollander addressed the man who had abused her and hundreds of others. She said in part, "In our early hearings, you brought your Bible into the courtroom. You spoke of praying for forgiveness. But Larry, if you have read the Bible you carry, you know forgiveness does not come by doing good things, as if good things can erase what you have done. It comes from repentance, which requires facing and acknowledging the truth about what you have done in all its utter depravity and horror, without mitigation, without excuse. The Bible you carry says it is better for a millstone to be thrown around your neck and you thrown into a lake than for you to make even one child stumble. And you have damaged hundreds. The Bible you carry speaks of a final judgment, where all of God's wrath in its eternal terror is poured out on men like you. Should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing." So Den Hollander speaks to a future justice, the eschatological promise that the whole earth will face God's justice. The Matthean genealogy is concerned with establishing Jesus as descended from the royal Davidic line in accordance with various messianic prophecies. It confirms Jesus's earthly and cosmic soteriological significance. Through the flesh-affirming incarnation, flesh-glorifying resurrection, and flesh-exalting ascension, flesh received justice. It signifies that God did not come just into the world to save sinners, but actually to restore the sinned against. It is justice for Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and all they represent, that justice ultimately will prevail. However, the MeToo genealogy reminds us that the inbreaking of God's justice is not only anticipation of a future justice, but an active justice, a justice requiring action now. And actually, it's too late in terms of all the historic cases. The MeToo genealogy demonstrates that for sexual violation, God's justice bringing through Christ begins at the manger. In an Advent sermon, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says of Christ's birth, "The judgment and redemption of the world, that is what is happening here." He continues, "For those who are great and powerful in this world, there are two places where their courage fails them, which terrify them to the very depths of their souls, and which they dearly avoid. They are the manger and the cross of Jesus Christ. No one who holds power dares to come near the manger. King Herod also did not dare." But through the genealogy, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and of course Mary, who I can't incorporate in this paper, are as close as it is possible to be to the manger. Ian Clements argues, and by their presence in the genealogy, they serve to anticipate the Matthean Messiah's concern for those who are structurally marginalized. They also provide a hint that the future community of disciples the Messiah gathers to follow him will be differently comprised. With the urgency of a Christian ethicist, I want to go further and suggest that Jesus' justice-bringing ministry begins with the issue of sexual violation because this issue is present at his birth. It is not deferred until his public ministry. The MeToo genealogy demonstrates God's justice bringing for survivors of sexual violation, and the institution of the order of sexual justice amidst the chaos of injustice begins at the manger. In the act of love which the Incarnation embodies, it is an exercise of justice which involves not treating people as objects, but as people. And this recovers a sense of dignity that can be lost when justice is devoid of this realm of attention in personal and political ways, such as sexual violation. The MeToo genealogy situates us in the realm of attention to bodies and to the systems and cultures which denigrate, abuse, and deny justice to bodily integrity. This attention causes us to notice the injustice, notice God's condemnation on injustice, and God's rightness and right-directedness, which then makes demands on our own right-directedness. I think I'm going over time. How am I doing?
If you would wrap it up, that'd be great.
Great. I will just wrap it up there. There are loads of things I can't include, and I've just got the chat pinging at me. So I will just stop there.
Do you want to have a final sentence or something?
Silence breaking, justice bringing, potentially useful for Christian ethics.
That's great. That's brilliant. I was going to say those are these points that stick out to me as well. And honestly, we have so much going on in the chat. We got some sarcasm from one of our presenters. That's fun. But no shame. Sarcasm is all fun. We're all friends here, so it's good. I think I think we should really respond to Helen's question about within the genealogy in Matthew, we have another male victim of sexual abuse, Jacob, and 3 male abusers, Abraham, Judah, David, most likely, and definitely Solomon in my reading. How does this fit in with what you are presenting?
Yeah, so in my lovely massive PhD thesis, I have all the space to make all those comments. So yeah, it makes a far more holistic understanding of what we mean by justice and what we mean by redemption. So yes, frustratingly cursory reading of the genealogy. I'm really sorry. I promise in my footnotes, which is no use to a presentation like this. But yes, that's really important in terms of, you know, justice in Christian ethics is a really complicated topic because you always want to prioritize justice for who has been sinned against, but there is this form of justice for those who are sinners that actually they can receive redemption, and that's such a minefield in so many spheres, particularly sexual violation. So I was also being a bit of a coward in terms of not incorporating that this evening. I'm very sorry.
No, it wasn't a criticism, Hannah, at all. It was just a kind of musing on what you were saying. So thank you.
Yeah, and I see the Mary point as well. Yes, again, I've got a very lovely, fat, juicy footnote in here about Mary and about just how consensual the Annunciation is. That's, again, could be a whole paper on its own. And there's lots of talk amongst scholars about how Mary, so she shares many qualities with these women, you know, in terms of having a risky, societally unacceptable pregnancy, for example. But then, you know, she's Mary with this legacy where all generations will call me blessed. That incredible song of justice she has in the Magnificat in Luke's Gospel. So she's a fascinating juxtaposition of, you know, a woman who otherwise would have had so many people trying to denigrate her and do her down. And yet she is absolutely revered in the Christian tradition. So again, she adds this fascinating texture to how we read the genealogy.
This is great. Honestly, we could probably have so many more questions, but I want to move on to our final paper, and then hopefully we'll have a bit more time at the end